Okay, I'm gonna draw this down. So I ask everyone to take their seats. We're gonna get the committee to come to order, please. I'd like to remind all those in attendance that their phones be on silent or vibrate, and I ask the committee members to introduce themselves, starting with Mr. McKay.
Good morning and welcome to such a large group today. I'm Hugh McKay, MLA for Chester St. Margaret's.
Morning. Bill Horn, Waverley Fall River Beaverbank, filling in for Gordon Wilson from Clare Digby.
Good morning. Suzanne Lonis-Croft, MLA Lunenburg.
And I'm Barbara Adams from Cole Harbour Eastern Passage, filling in for Alan McMaster from Inverness.
Good morning. Welcome. My name is Tim Houston. I'm the MLA for Pictou East.
Good morning. Dave Wilson, MLA for Sackville-Cobgood.
And hello, I'm Lisa Roberts, CMLA for Halifax Needham.
And we'll...
Ben Jessom, Hammonds Plains, Lucasville. Excuse me, everyone.
So on today's agenda, we have the officials from the Department of Community Services, Department of Health and Wellness, Department of Education and Early Childhood Development, the Nova Scotia Health Authority and the IWK with us to discuss services and supports for children with autism spectrum disorder and complex needs. I ask that the witnesses introduce themselves, and we'll start with some opening remarks. I'm sure many of you want to give an opening remark, so we ask that we keep it, we be mindful of time for questioning.
Good morning, Denise Perret, Deputy Minister, Health and Wellness.
Francine Vezina, Project Executive, Department of Health and Wellness.
Lynn Hartwell, Deputy Minister, Community Services.
Joe Rudderham, Executive Director of the Disability Support Program in the Department of Community Services.
Wendy Bungay, Director of Placement Services, Department of Community Services.
Jocelyn Vine, VP of Patient Care, IWK Health Centre.
Andrew Link, Chief of Pediatrics at the IWK.
Susan Jozsa, Autism Consultant, Department of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Ann Power, Executive Director, Student Equity and Support Services, Education.
Good morning, Karen Gatien. I'm the Associate Deputy Minister at the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Good morning, I'm Lindsay Peach, Vice President, Integrated Health Services with the Nova Scotia Health Authority.
And we'll start with opening remarks. Yes. Deputy Minister of Health, Denise Perret.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss services and supports for children with autism spectrum disorder. As you're likely aware, autism spectrum disorder, or shortened to ASD, is a developmental disability that causes a range of social, communication, and behavioral challenges. There are many degrees of autism and unique circumstances. On the evidentiary front, we are still learning about the incidence and manifestation of ASD, and ongoing research in this area guides the health system policy programs and services. Health's policy priority is to provide the best start in life for children with autism. In addition to the base operating grant, the Department of Health and Wellness provides funding to the health authorities for the early diagnosis and services for children with ASD and their families. Health's dedicated budget for autism is over $15 million. The majority of this budget, approximating $13 million, funds universal EIBI, which is early intensive behavioral intervention. It's delivered to preschool-aged children through our colleagues at the IWK and the NSHA, and this is done in partnership with the Nova Scotia Hearing and Speech Centres. EIBI involves the development and delivery of an individualized treatment plan coordinated by a team consisting of parents, one-to-one interventionists, clinical specialists, and speech-language pathologists. The goal is to facilitate development of the child's communication, play, and other functional skills before the child enters primary school. Last year, more than 150 children in Nova Scotia started the EIBI program, and more than 300 were receiving intensive services at some point in the year. The demand for services has increased significantly. Over the past decade, we've seen the prevalence of autism spectrum disorder almost double. And in part, this is due to broader diagnosis and greater awareness. In addition to EIBI, Diagnosis and other supports are provided by the IWK Autism team and the NSHA Child and Youth Mental Health and Addiction teams across the province. These teams support families when children need to access mental health services. They are also involved when care planning is required for children with complex care needs. Autism requires a shared approach. Health programs and services are only part of the equation. As a result, work is ongoing to build a comprehensive continuum of services that addresses the full scope of program and service needs. The shared goal of the organizations represented here today are to serve and support the interests and needs of children with ASD and their families. In this regard, the input and advocacy received from parents and organizations like Autism Nova Scotia is important. We appreciate their tireless efforts to give their children and the families they represent the best support possible, and we thank them for the work they do to inform our policies and programs. We're also grateful for the dedicated work of frontline staff who support and serve these children and families every day. Our organizations strive to coordinate and integrate our programs and services, and the representatives from Education and Early Childhood Development and Community Services will explain more about the range of services provided. So I thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I'll turn it over to my colleague Karen Gatien from Education.
Ms. Gage.
Thank you for this opportunity to continue the discussion regarding supports and services for ASD. As Deputy Perret has noted, there are many challenges faced by individuals with ASD and their families. Some children and youth with ASD manage very well in our public system, and there are others who have more significant learning and behavioral needs who require more support through education and from our government partners. We're working hard together to continue to build connections with these partners in government and community to provide an integrated, multidisciplinary service model to ensure that all children, including those with ASD, receive the best education possible. Early learning opportunities are especially important for children with ASD, and EECD was an early partner in efforts to get the EIBI established here in Nova Scotia. Last year, we also introduced the pre-primary program to 46 school communities as an early play-based experience for children before they enter grade primary. This fall, we add an additional 91 school communities for a total of 137, which will offer the pre-primary program, and government has invested $24 million to date in that program. As of March 2018, there were 24 children in pre-primary with a diagnosis of ASD. And children with ASD in the pre-primary program can access the special supports that they need. So these can include EIBI, Developmental Intervention Services, Pediatric Psychology Services at the IWK, Nova Scotia Hearing and Speech Services, Occupational Therapy, and Physical Therapy. Our school-based teams work with pre-primary, EIBI, and other service providers to transition children with ASD into school. This is a good example of the multidisciplinary planning that takes place for children with ASD. Children need to be ready, families need to be ready. School staff and school-based specialists need to be ready, and we're united in our commitment to make that happen. EECD has also provided funding for provincial training and intervention strategies to help children with ASD who need it in the early grades, so from grades primary to 2. The STAR program, or Strategies for Teaching-Based in Autism Research, is one of these programs. And through the years, EECD has also added positions and programs to address the learning needs for students with ASD. Susan Jozsa, who's here with me today, began as the single school-based ASD specialist in the province. And today we have 14.5 full-time equivalents across the 7 regional centres for education and the French CSAP board. We value the special expertise they bring to the classroom and educational planning for children and youth with ASD. In addition to the ASD specialists, we have created positions in behavior support, program planning, and increased positions in speech-language pathology and psychology to develop programs and interventions specific to the needs of students with ASD from grades primary through to 12. Students with ASD require skill building in different areas, and social communication is a notable area of challenge. We have invested in training and implementation since 2013 in the program for the education and enrichment of relational skills known as PEERS. This program is for older students with ASD to learn those important skills for developing relationships with peers and others in the community as they prepare to transition from school. And our partnership with the Atlantic Province's Special Education Authority has been particularly successful. APSE's Autism and Education Partnership brings together the Departments of Education and Early Childhood Development from the 4 Atlantic provinces to promote current research and best practices in ASD and offer training and professional learning. This partnership developed a 40-hour ASD online course offered in both English and French that has been taken by over 1,700 school-based staff in Nova Scotia. In addition, APSE AIE offers an ongoing webinar series and a 2-day symposium. Yesterday, government announced its plans to move forward with the recommendations in the report from the Commission on Inclusive Education. We'll be working together under a new inclusion policy framework. Part of this first stage of our work will be to develop a provincial autism strategy for education, and we will of course be involving our partners in its development. We're committed to ensuring quality education for all students, including those with ASD, through our training and program development. And government is adding $15 million to education to make that happen. We will be increasing specialist positions across the regional centres for education and the CSAP, including adding 15 new ASD specialists, 30 behaviour support teachers to support classrooms, and 25 learning centre and resource teachers and program planning specialists. We recognize that vulnerable youth and students with complex issues require additional support, and we're introducing 40 child and youth care practitioners to help develop and implement specific programs and interventions. We will also be investing in 11 parent navigators to help families understand what programs and resources are available in school and how to access the supports and services for outside of school. We'll be funding a training program for teachers to become board-certified behavior analysts, and these individuals will take advanced training in behavioral analysis to train other staff and support program development for students with ASD who have significant learning and behavioral challenges. Together, our board-certified behavior analysts, autism specialists, behavior support teachers, and child and youth care practitioners will work with teachers and students to create positive, healthy, safe learning experiences. We have listened to teachers and families tell us that their children with ASD need specialized intervention to deal with some very complicated behavioral challenges that affect learning, relationship with peers, and create family crisis. This is not a job that any one department can do alone, and I think my colleagues here today would agree with that. The investment shared today in the work we can do together will help us in a path forward. So I'll now turn it over to our colleague at the Department of Community Services, Deputy Minister Lynn Hartwell, to talk about their work.
Deputy Minister Hartwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to my colleagues for their remarks. I will try to keep my remarks short so that we can get to the questions on this topic. It's a topic that's of great importance to all of our departments, and Community Services is interested in talking a little bit more about the role that we play. What we know to be true is that children do best when they're with their families. And so we have at Community Services a role in providing respite support services that enable families to hire the respite that works for them. That respite can include individuals known to the family who can provide some much needed hours of relief. It can provide the hiring of people who have particular specialized training and education. And these families help shoulder the burden that and the challenges and the wonderful opportunities that families may face in caring for these children. Our direct family support program for children is part of our larger disability support program. Overall, our program, of which Mr. Rudderham is the executive director, provides children, youth, and adults with intellectual disabilities, long-term mental illness, and physical disabilities a range of community-based residential and vocational or day programming. Our direct family support program for children is, as I've mentioned, a respite program. It provides eligible families up to $2,200 a month for respite services, and we have an enhanced program for people who are experiencing greater needs, and that amount is up to $3,800 a month. In February, we were able to eliminate the wait list for this program, so there is actually now no longer any cap for the program. So if a family needs that support, we are able to provide it. Many families who are purchasing or looking to find the respite services that work for their family may struggle with that. And so one of the things that we're introducing this year is a respite coordination program so that we can help families find the respite support providers that they need. And again, that is a very personal and unique matching, because you can imagine having people come into your home and provide support to your family. You want to make sure that it's the right person. We have heard from families consistently that often their best sources of referral are other families and others that are known to them, and so it's building on the strengths that the very strong community-based organizations already have in this area. We are working as well to reduce the wait list in our adult program, our community disability support programs, so that we're able to, when children age into more independence, we're able to provide them with families with a path for their children. We have programs that include the adult version of our direct support family support program for children, which is called Flex Independent. So it has the same levels of funding. So children can remain as they age with their families even after they turn 19, if that's what works for that family. We also have Flex Independent. There's Flex at Home, which was the first one, Flex Independent, where people are able to live independently with the support of their family, whether that's in an apartment or some other location that, again, the family and the individual have chosen, and we're able to provide supports. Then we have other programs such as the Independent Living Support Program and the Alternative Family Support Program, which again offer pathways for young people as they age into adulthood. By reducing the wait list for those programs, we are looking to have more people getting the support they need to live independent lives and be able to participate fully in their communities. In that vein, we're also looking to create opportunities for young people to attach to the labour market, and I want to mention that we are working with Autism Nova Scotia to help people better transition into the workforce through some job coaching. In our respite program, we do have parents who have been purchasing job coaching supports through the respite funding. This is an opportunity to create even more opportunity for young people who have autism and their parents to start to imagine what a future is going to look like as they age into adulthood. So we can look forward to Autism Nova Scotia being able to offer employment support services to adults on the spectrum over the next 3 years. So that's a great piece of work that I'm happy to talk about. One of the challenges that we work on with our colleagues, and we need the strong partnerships that exist, is finding appropriate placements for children and youth who have extreme behavioral issues and who are in a place where they are no longer able to be cared for by their family. And it may be that their family has other challenges going on, or it may be that particular behaviors have been exacerbated, etc. We know, as I said at the beginning, children need families. Many of the children who are on the spectrum need structure, need familiar surroundings, and they need their unique needs to be captured in their care arrangements. And then sometimes the families need something different than that care being provided at home. So we do have a network of service providers around the province that we can go to create the one specific arrangement for that family. Again, always with the idea that we're providing supports that allow that child or youth to return to their family with the supports that they need. Fortunately, those situations are lesser in number, and I would say those are the times when our organizations pull together, and we can also share some information with you about how we have complex case protocols to make sure that we and the colleagues that you see seated before you are working together to make sure that we're wrapping some services around families. For many of the people that community services helps, we have a broad range of programs. The services and supports are an interim solution for people as they're moving forward. We also know that there are people who will require supports from the Department of Community Services and supports from our partners for most of their lives. And we are spending a fair bit of time working to improve our ability to plan ahead and have proactive supports in place so that we're not simply responding to crisis. We need to build pathways for young people and their family that is based on their strength, that recognizes some of the challenges and opportunities that come with the neurodiversity that they bring. And so part of our work is creating the places where we and our colleagues can come forward and start with the child and that family at the centre and build supports out. The transition to adulthood period is a period that we are spending a fair bit of time because we know that that can be a real source of challenge for families. We have made good progress and we recognize there is still work to do. We are working with our partners, as I've said, to address the challenges. I look forward to answering your questions and being able to provide some more information about the work we're doing.
And we'll start with questioning the Conservative Caucus, and Mr. Houston, please. 20 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for their opening statements. I have to say this is the most witnesses I've ever seen appear before committee. There's more witnesses than committee members here today, which on the one hand I guess is a good indication of the seriousness of it. But the thing that scares me is how could a family possibly know where to turn if it takes this many witnesses to come before committee to answer questions? I mean, I think what we're seeing here is what people, you often hear people say about government, it's not my department, and I just wonder, like, how could a family possibly navigate through the system when there's this many witnesses that are necessary to come before committee to answer questions? It's a definite concern to me. The Department of Health mentioned that they've invested $15 million in ASD services, I guess. The Department of Education, I wonder if there's a similar number. What would the Department of Education say is the investment in ASD services?
Ms. Gate.
Do you have that number? I'll ask Ann Power, the Executive Director, to respond.
Ms. Power.
So we have targeted grants of $630,000 that are specific to ASD to help with the implementation of programs that Deputy Gatien mentioned before, and Assistant Deputy. And we have a number of positions within the ranks of education staff who provide services to a number of children, not just specifically to children with ASD. So for instance, we would have 92 speech-language pathologists, and they will serve the students within their catchment area. We have 72 school psychologists, 1,357 education assistants, 770 resource teachers, and 14.5 specific to ASD specialists who are working specifically just with those students. But many of our staff, including teachers, classroom teachers, and the new staff that we have coming in will be working with those students as well. And in addition, we have 30 new behavior support teachers and 15 specific new specialists to add to the approximate 15 that we have now specific to ASD. I would need to get you the salaries of all of those people to add it up, but it's a significant investment.
Sure. And
Mr. Houston.
Thank you. And the $630,000 in grants, is that kind of student-specific grants or school-specific, or?
Ms. Power?
Yes, it's really more to the regional centres of education, and we provide them with targeted grants each year that they can use for professional learning and professional development so that the teachers stay current, and new teachers coming into the system can also learn the techniques and skills of such programs as STAR, which is Strategies for Teaching Based on Autism Research, or PEERS, which is the Program for the Education and Enrichment of Relational Skills.
Thank you.
Mr. Houston?
Thank you. And community services, what would you say is the investment from community services? And
Deputy Minister Hartwell.
ASD services.
Thank you. Specific to children, I can say that we spend roughly around $12.5 million. Children on the autism spectrum are about 35% of our caseload in our direct family support program. We would spend an additional amount of money, which I can get to do with a little bit of work, if we have children who are on the autism spectrum who happen to be in the care of the minister. We would also be providing some supports there as well.
Mr. Houston?
Okay, thank you. For the IWK conducted an internal review of its autism services. Is that review finished, and can we get a copy of that report?
Ms. Vine? Ms. Vine?
Thank you. So I'll just start with a little bit of background on the purpose behind the review and explain where we are on that process. So recognizing the challenges that we've been speaking of here, we recognize an opportunity within our organization to really focus, as we do in all areas of our service, on quality improvement and looking for opportunities to work together across our system and also with our colleagues at Nova Scotia Health Authority to identify opportunities to streamline aspects of work and make sure that the flow of patients goes well. We also had the opportunity to hear directly from patients and families who really explained their experiences to us as well. One of the foundational pieces of a quality review within the healthcare system, and this is common across healthcare systems, is really creating a confidential environment so that all clinicians, families, providers, etc., can really give us their confidential perspective on what is happening. And what the reviewers do is then synthesize that information into a list of recommendations. So the review itself is not a matter of public record. It is a matter of a tool for us to improve. And the recommendations that we have from that report are forming the foundation of ongoing quality and improvement efforts within the healthcare centre. And I think would not be surprising, the themes. So for example, for families, at times they find it challenging to navigate across systems. So they gave us ideas and suggestions on that. And I'll just hand over to Dr. Andrew Link to see if he wanted to add some further comments.
Dr. Link?
I think, Jocelyn, you sort of stated that quite well. That report served as a catalyst, and I can tell you that there's a lot of senior leadership and a lot of our teams at the IWK have been spending a lot of hours over the last couple months trying to make the system better for families and children, getting families involved. We've been taking half days or several days out of our clinical work and just devoting it to this, and that work is ongoing to try to be streamlined, try to be responsive, and try to identify the gaps of where we could do better. So
Mr. Houston?
Thank you. So the review is confidential, I guess. The recommendations that came out of the review also confidential?
Ms. Vine?
The recommendations were shared with the providers within our healthcare system, and the themes from those recommendations are really helping to guide our quality improvement efforts. But in general, the report itself is confidential in order to ensure that for this review and any future reviews that we do within the healthcare system, that people feel very open in telling us where they see the opportunities for us.
Mr. Houston?
Thank you. Would you have discussed the report with maybe at least Autism Nova Scotia, or is there anyone else involved that could help develop those themes, I guess?
Ms. Vine?
I would say that we do work with Autism Nova Scotia on a regular basis, and we have families who are members of Autism Nova Scotia who are part of our quality improvement processes. Absolutely, yes.
Mr. Houston?
Do you feel that members of the autism community would be satisfied with that response, which is kind of like, we looked into it, we know what to do, and we're going to do it, but we can't tell you what we're doing? I don't want to oversimplify it, but that's basically, I'm hearing you can't see the review, you can't know what changes we're making, but we did a review and we're making changes. Do you think that people would be satisfied with that?
I wouldn't characterize it in that exact way. So what we're doing is when we have identified an area for improvement, we then set up a working group basically that involves members of the autism community who are then helping to advise us ongoing. So it's very much a co-design improvement journey that we tend to use. We find that is incredibly powerful because families can give us tremendous insights on what will work for them, what works for their children, and also they are also really connected to other families with autism often, so they can bring broader perspectives. And we tend to have families engaged who were involved in our services and maybe have graduated from them, but also those who are currently in the middle of them. So we find that incredibly valuable input and really helps to move us forward.
Mr. Houston?
Thank you. I'm not sure who to direct the next question to, but most members of the committee, most witnesses would probably be familiar with the experiences of the Sutherland family, which were chronicled in a number of news articles. And my question is, what services are available for those families who are at the most challenging end of the spectrum? Would anything be different today? Like the Sutherland family kind of fell through. The services weren't available. Okay, I see a funny expression there from, I caught you by surprise, I guess, with that summary, but from my understanding of the news reports, there wasn't a lot of services for them. That may take you by surprise, but that's certainly my understanding from watching the news. Am I wrong? And I guess I'd direct to Mr. Rudderham there, because you had a strong reaction to that statement from me. Did that family fall through the cracks, or did they miss services that were available, or are there services available? Or what was the reason for your response to that?
Mr. Rudderham.
Thank you, and I apologize for my facial expressions. They don't necessarily represent what I'm thinking at the time. But in any case, it's. I'm not going to say that the Sutherland family didn't struggle and didn't have very intense needs. What I would say is that the three departments came together, or the two departments came together, and actually found some really good solutions. And as much as any individual family might struggle in any given moment, we have a process in place which we actually address those concerns, and we try to wrap around the services needed to ensure that the family is able to stay together, and with a priority that we actually have the family stay together within the home. Is the system perfect? No. Do we do all we possibly can to help families? Yes, we do. And we make changes, and we're involved in continuous improvement of programs, expanding the Flex program, for example, providing more supports, and now beginning to look as well into how we can, in those very, very particular situations where the resource requirements are intense, how we can provide those supports to make sure the young Nova Scotian remains with their family. So the Sutherland, as much as there were struggles, there was also, I think, great success as well.
Mr. Houston.
Thank you for that. And I guess I'd stay with community services on it, because you did reference in your comments the network of service providers that can provide supports the family needs. Even under complex cases, I think you have a complex case protocol you referred to. So I guess the response is that there are services there, but we just got to kind of know how to access them. Is that what you would say?
Minister Hartwell.
Thank you very much. I'll give a little bit of a history, I think, that helps explain a little bit. With your indulgence. In 1997, the province made the decision that that it would close what we were called children's training centres. So those were large centres where children who had challenging behaviors, more profound disability lived. And I think that was the right decision because, as I said earlier, children do better when they're in a family environment. As a result of that, though, there are no children's facilities that remain. So there are no places that are appropriate as part of a formal continuum for a child to be placed and receive the types of support. In part recognizing that's not where children thrive. They thrive in families. So the entire system has been reoriented to try to provide supports to families in home. Now, one of the things that, in one of the comments that you made was about it takes all of us to be here to answer questions, and I actually see that as a really good thing. The partnerships that we are able to create, the solutions that are unique to fit a particular family, that's where the magic is. It is actually not in creating a standardized response to every family situation, and it does take all of us to do that.
I'll stop you there for a second,
Mr. Houston,
if you don't mind, because what concern? I love teamwork and team approaches, but sometimes you have too many people involved. Nobody feels accountable. So I guess I'm thinking of the Choosing Now report that was done for families living with autism. 42 recommendations were made by that. Would you feel responsible for implementing any of those 42 recommendations as the Department of Community Services, or is that somebody else's job? Or like that's what concerns me is who would take ownership of working with Autism Nova Scotia to say which of these 42 recommendations could be done? Would that be Community Services?
Deputy Minister Hartwell. So
I was getting to that point, which is that while we share responsibility, we also have an accountability. So when that report or any report like that comes out, there is often a lead department who takes the lead. I know that there have been in the past, there have been times when it's been the Department of Education, Early Childhood Development that's taken the lead. Other times it's been the Department of Health. We certainly are at all the tables. In each of our systems, we also not only are striving to work together at a senior level to make sure that we have policy coherence and that we're addressing any kind of challenges or gaps that may exist, but our frontline staff work together quite closely as well. So in our DCS system, every family that's involved with us has a care coordinator. That person's job, it is in part to do some of the liaising so that the family has a place that they can go. If they are involved heavily in the school system, I know that there are folks that would take the lead depending on the need of the family at that time. So the announcement yesterday about 11 parent navigators is really exciting because parents often, they are without a doubt the most effective advocate for their child. So to give them a formalized support that there are other parents that they can go to, that will help. It won't replace the expertise that a care coordinator might bring, but at least there's there's that point person. To your point, a family shouldn't have to look at 20 different people and figure out who's the one to help. They should have one person they can go to, but that one person could be located in each of our systems, again, depending on where the family is at that point.
Mr. Houston, thank you for that. Thank you. Who's the lead department on the Choosing Now report?
Deputy Minister Hartwell.
You said there's often a lead department on a report like this.
Deputy Minister
Who would be the lead department on the Choosing Now report?
On the Choosing Now report, I believe it's the Department of Health.
Okay, I'd like to ask.
Mr. Houston?
Oh, sorry, they just whispered in my ear. No, it's the Department of Education.
Okay, so the Department of the Education is the lead department of, you don't have total agreement on who's the lead department on there. The Department of Education, not the lead department on the Choosing Now.
Okay, then whoever whispered in my ear is wrong. It is the Department of Health.
Okay. Department of Health. We could try it again. Would the Department of Health consider themselves to be the lead department on the Choosing Now report?
Ms. Vezina?
My understanding is I don't believe the document was commissioned per se by government. I believe that it was an independently written and submitted report. Having said that, we do have a great working relationship as well with Autism Nova Scotia. We have started implementation of some of the recommendations that are in there, such as the implementation of the 8 autism resource centres, as well as the care.
So in the interest of time, Houston. I'm going to come back to that in the second round, but just so I know to now, I would say some reluctant ownership of the Choosing Now report by the Department of Health, or is the Department of Health the lead department on that?
Ms. Vezina?
Deputy. Deputy Perret.
I think what you're getting is a response to the concept of lead department in the context of the report. I would go back to my opening comments. We really appreciate this type of input, and it's the type of input that informs our policy and programs. So as Ms. Vezina has said, we take that report, we're looking at the recommendations, we work with our partners, but we are starting to implement some of them and consider them in policy and program planning.
Okay, there's 42 recommendations in the Choosing Now report. Do you know how many?
That's time.
Thank you.
And we'll go to the NDP and Lisa Roberts.
Thank you very much. I would like to start in that moment of crisis that the Sutherland family arrived at, having provided a lot of support in their home, where they needed help from the IWK. And so I think perhaps this is most appropriately directed to, I don't know, Deputy Minister Perret or to the IWK. What services are available in that moment of crisis for a family with a loved one who has ASD and needs help beyond what they have been able to resource through at-home support from your various departments?
Deputy Minister Perret.
Thank you. It's an important question, and it's an experience that we all learn from. So in some cases, the starting point is within the health system, as you noted, and a child, say at the IWK, that is in a critical situation is going to be assessed, and there is going to be a care plan put together. So in the Sutherland's case, that child isn't falling between the cracks in the sense of once assessed at the IWK, a comprehensive care plan is developed. Where there have been challenges, and we recognize them and we work on them, is in the transition points, because the hospital isn't a long-term residential environment. And so, as Deputy Hartwell has indicated, we're then looking at how we can either support the child and the family in the home, or if there has to be a more secure residential environment, we look at how to set that up. And as I said in my opening remarks, these are highly individualized treatments plans with a tremendous amount of resources that go into creating them. And so it's true that sometimes it takes us some time to respond in a customized fashion to the needs and services that that child and family need. I can assure you, and I think there would be agreement here that we are getting better at that as we come together to the point that we have daily conference calls when we have some of these cases to coordinate these transition points and make it as easy for families as possible.
Ms. Roberts.
Thank you. I'd like to share some of the story of Kyuman Ang, who is 15 years old and has ASD. And according to a news report from December 2017, and this was referring to a crisis that his family encountered in 2015, he spent 37 days at the Gatien Centre. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, at the IWK. But there were no specific services or treatments for children with autism. And Ang and his mom, Marnie Adams, say it changed nothing for their family. Currently, when families are resorting to, I guess initially probably a call to 911 or a visit to the emergency room at the IWK, when they arrive there, and given that there is no other residential facility, as Deputy Minister Hartwell spoke to, is the Gatien Centre actually, is it geared up? Is it resourced with appropriate therapeutic services so that it's not just a holding space until the child is returned home? Is there capacity there to help those children and those families actually get to a better spot at the point that they're exiting those doors. I think.
Ms. Vine?
Yeah. Thank you. While I wouldn't comment on a particular situation, as you would understand, the role of the Gatien unit, I think, is important for us to understand, and it is a highly acute care environment. So when a young person with any psychiatric diagnosis is admitted to that unit, really the main focus of a high acuity unit like that is a level of stabilization. And once that stabilization process is underway, then we're able to start pulling in additional resources. So it does take time often for stabilization to occur. Often when there is a particularly serious crisis for a family, even the time that it takes to do the proper medical and psychiatric workup does take time. So I potentially that is part of it. But IWK does have specialized resources for autism, and we are able to mobilize those resources to the Gatien unit, the psychiatric inpatient unit, yes.
Ms. Roberts?
You know, again, in Mr. Eng's case, he says he's gone to the IWK emergency department more than 10 times, but has been admitted twice. If not to the Gatien unit, like if a person is not in such need of stabilization that admission there makes sense, is there another place within the IWK, again, given that someone is arriving at the emergency room or calling 911 because things at home are really not working in that moment? They are dangerous for family members, they're dangerous for the individual with ASD. So is there a resource at the IWK on an inpatient basis with where those ASD services are located?
Ms. Vine?
Really what I would say is that when there is a high acuity situation for a young person with autism that includes psychiatric diagnoses or medical diagnoses, those services are provided in the most appropriate location for that child. But in general, best practice would tell us that inpatient services are not ideal. The best approach to dealing with young people and their families is to make sure that the services, wraparound, and supports are brought to them in their normal environment. So that is typically the most appropriate role, and that's the goal we're always trying to get to. But in terms of inpatient admission, those should be as limited as possible. For individuals with ASD, coming out of their home environment into an unfamiliar environment is often more harmful than good.
Ms. Roberts?
Thank you. I do appreciate that. I also appreciate, I guess, the level of approaching despair that families are at the point that they arrive at the IWK. So to tell them, actually, you need to go home in that moment, or even in that week when that moment has probably come at the end of a month of, or months of crisis and failure to access resources. I think that's a little bit difficult to just accept, frankly. Our caucus did request the update from the working committee that is looking at the Autism Management Advisory Team report on lifespan needs that came out in 2010 and was updated in 2012. This update is from April 2017, and one of the recommendations from that 2010 report was that further exploration of crisis services for families and individuals with ASD should be investigated to determine if supports are appropriate, timely, and accessible. We were able to get sort of the full update on many of the recommendations, but that the information on the actions taken related to that recommendation were fully redacted. So it does have Department of Health and Wellness here as the lead agency. I would appreciate knowing what actions have been taken on that exploration of crisis services for families and individuals with ASD. Deputy Perret or Ms. Vine. Sorry.
Ms. Vezina.
Thank you. We, at the time, what our immediate actions were and our focus was expanding the mobile crisis unit for the mental health and addictions crisis line to expand that across the province. We continue to explore with our partners the needs around the crisis service for families with children with autism. As everyone has already indicated, we're looking at something a little bit more complex, something that's going to have to be very nimble and able to respond to a variety of needs for families.
Ms. Roberts.
Do you have a timeline on when families can expect to see something different sort of clearly on offer?
Ms. Vezina. Ms. Perret.
It's an important question. So as I referred to earlier, we have quite an increased focus on that issue. We've seen how important it is to work out more options for families when they're in that crisis point. I would reiterate what Ms. Vine said, that a hospital environment is not a good residential environment. And so part of this is putting those supports in place through things like crisis units, but probably on a more long-term basis, whether we need an alternate, secure and safe residential component that might be an interim solution, or the supports that are put into the home. So I think it's fair to say that our organizations, and I made reference to conference calls because I'm quite serious about it, we're doing those regularly to say what are our assets in sense of how many secure residential placements do we have, how do we get those right and skilled support workers that we can put in the home. As my colleague said, how are we nimble and adaptable to unique situations that have some very challenging requirements? Are we there yet? We're not. Are we aware that we're not there? Yes. Are we dealing with this daily? I can honestly say yes. So it is a high priority for all of us.
Deputy Minister Hartwell.
Thank you. I just wanted to add to my colleagues' comments that, to reiterate, we're part of those daily phone calls. And again, we are putting the needs of the child or youth, and the family at the center and trying to build the support outward. Because the experience in the past was, again, that children were in places where their unique needs weren't taken care of. And as we learn more about the particular needs of children who are on the spectrum, then we absolutely know that things like structure, things like familiar surroundings, and a sense of community that might look different than a community that are in other facilities are important. I referenced the network of service providers. We have service providers around the province, some of whom provide residential options for adults who are able to, when we have we are able to have a child or youth with a particular need, able to craft something that's a child appropriate situation. Sometimes they're longer term, sometimes they are to stabilize and to help a family or help a child over a particular piece. I can give you an example. We were working with a service provider right now who is training 5 staff, who has hired 5 and are training 5 to support one young man who's going to be at home with family. And those 5 people are going to be coming in and out of the home to provide the support. So that's what worked for that. That's what we believe is going to work for that young person, far better than us creating a place that he will be away from his family, away from the things that he knows. That may not be a solution for other families. For other families, they may need something a bit more remote. That's why it really is a one-off and quite situational.
Ms. Roberts.
Given that we're trying to put the needs of the individual and of the family at the center, do we have the resources necessary to come up with those solutions if they do require, a stay away from home, but also out of an acute hospital environment, which I understand is not appropriate. Do we have the resources that we need to be able to look at, a third option that provides both respite and therapy and stabilization?
Mr. Hartwell.
Thank you. We have a lot of resources that are currently in our system supporting children and families. They may not be where they need to be, again, to have a more nimble response. So it's finding a way to reroute some of the resources that we may have in a particular bricks and mortar solution that may not be the one that will support this child. So it's finding a way to reallocate. I will say that a resource challenge that we all share and that we all I believe we're all looking for is finding the skilled, trained individuals who have the ability to work with children and family, and sometimes in non-traditional settings, again, working in a home as opposed to working in a care facility. So we're always on the lookout for that, and often individuals need to be trained not just generally in autism, but specific to a child's particular needs. That child's own behavioral interventions may require an entire plan that people have to be trained on. So finding the people and training and supporting them is a big area of focus for us, for sure.
Ms. Roberts.
Again, in this progress update from April 2017, the progress on another recommendation was also fully redacted. That was the one about creating regional autism centers that should be located and coordinate services in key areas of the province. We have been talking very exclusively, we've been talking about the IWK, which is in Halifax. What progress has been made, please, on those regional autism centers that, were envisioned to include a lending library, resources for families and parents, a navigator or case manager, and those wraparound services?
Deputy Perret.
Thank you for the question. So in this year's budget, there is $300,000 for Autism Nova Scotia to establish 8 of the autism resource centers. And my understanding is that they are going to be located in the following communities: Yarmouth, Hebville, New Glasgow, Amherst, Truro, Kingston, Halifax, and Port Hawkesbury, with outreach to Sydney.
Thank you for
Ms.
that.
Roberts.
Thank you for that answer. So just to clarify, this is a progress report on the Autism Management Advisory Team report on lifespan needs from 2010, and none of the work towards those centers was done up until this budget year?
Deputy Perret.
So I don't have the history. I've only been here a year, but I can tell you that that budget is in place this year, and the work with Autism Nova Scotia to establish them is underway.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Roberts.
Thank you for that answer. Just quickly, because I want to get to it, and there's a lot that I could ask. For the representatives who are here from the Department of Education, obviously there's a lot of investment in EIBI, and now there's a significant investment in pre-primary. And it's great to hear that some children who have been diagnosed with autism are currently working within pre-primary, that there's 24 students with ASD in pre-primary. What happens, though, if for those children who will not be diagnosed until later? So perhaps you have a diagnosis at 5.5, either of a student who is not currently accessing pre-primary, or even a student who is in pre-primary but doesn't get the diagnosis till later. Will they be able to benefit from EIBI, perhaps by repeating pre-primary, or how is the system working with those families?
Ms. Gatien.
So you can't repeat pre-primary, but it is voluntary, so they could choose to wait a year. But certainly if the diagnosis came later, they would have access to all the supports within the education system, say 5.5, all the program planning and supports that would happen for all students while they're in school. Do you want to add anything in?
Ms. Vine?
And if the diagnosis does come within 6 months of school entry, we can offer EIBI for that 6 months and then transition into the school system. There is a plan for the clinicians who work with children to transition them into the school. So a minimum of 6 months in order to be effective is what's required. Otherwise, it would be, as the education colleagues mentioned.
Ms. Roberts?
In the hopes that my Liberal colleagues will allow an answer to my question as I run down the clock. So just to clarify, so if that diagnosis comes at 6 instead, what happens for that child? Are they effectively too late for EIBI? In which case, what happens?
Ms. Vine?
I think that's when the answer is, as was said, with the education system. EIBI, the window is up until school entry, and then a transition plan is made to transition the child into the school system and access the resources in the school system.
That's time. We are going to head over to Ms. Lomscroft. I just ask that for the members of the committee, when you ask your question, that you direct it toward one of the departments to simplify this. Ms. Lomscroft?
I will try. There's so many of it. And thank you all for being here. Autism has been very important for me. It's been a large part of my career, supporting families and students with autism. And I've seen great progress. I'm really happy to hear the investments that have been made in the last number of years into inclusion. And the announcement yesterday, there are some parts of it, I'll get to them later. Did Ms. Roberts have her answer completely answered? Her question was completely answered? Okay. So she was talking about the EIBI, and which was created around 2008, I understand, but it was a lottery. It's no longer a lottery, and I'm pleased to hear that. Could someone speak to me about how you go about getting into the program? And I know it's a preschool program, but a lot of autism is diagnosed around 18 months to 2 years. So what is the timeline there?
Ms. Vine.
So typically a child may come forward in multiple different ways, and Dr. Link will be able to speak to his experience as a pediatrician, because being referred to a pediatrician would be an example of a way a child at a young age, parents might notice something that they feel is not typical, and that would lead to engagement with their local pediatrician. They could be referred to a mental health service. They could come to the IWK, and that would lead to a diagnostic process. And then once a diagnosis, if a diagnosis is ASD, then they would be eligible to receive EIBI in that preschool period. And you're right, the access to EIBI is now universal, and we are able to offer spots to every child prior to that, requirement to enter school at age 6.
Ms. Lomscroft.
Then as we move on, we've made investments into the pre-primary program. We're adding more classes next year. I've toured a couple of locations, and I've heard some success stories of students who've come in with autism, and it took a few months for the transition to go smoothly. Do you see this as a way of making that first year in school more successful for many of the students with autism?
Ms. Vines.
I would certainly say so. The focus of EIBI is really to build on the strengths and work very closely with both the parents, the family, and the school system at the point of transition to really build the opportunities and skills around communication, which we know if a child is able to communicate their needs, their wants, that is really going to help them to be successful. They also learn the beginnings of social skills and how to relate to others, which is another key area of development. And so those areas of focus are really the work that is done with EIBI. Parents are also trained in order to do that work, and there's a lot of expertise within the school system. So I hope that answers your question. I'm not sure whether education colleagues would have additional comments.
Sure.
Jozsa? Ms. Jozsa?
I would just say that with regards to the pre-primary program, the focus of that program is actually on play and the development of social skills. So it really dovetails quite nicely for those youngsters with ASD who are also receiving EIBI. And the program that we have that we referred to earlier, the STAR program, or the Strategies for Teaching based on Autism Research, has a component in it that is very much linked to the primary focus of the program in EIBI related to communication and social interaction. So we really try to work very hard to transition our young children with autism in pre-primary and then again into school, being very mindful of those challenges that the children face, as Jocelyn really well described.
Ms. Lomas-Croft.
Hey, thank you. I was really excited to hear about the Parent Navigator program. If that's one thing that I get even as an MLA, these parents are incredible who live every day with family members, and some families are dealing with more than one individual with autism. They are incredible. They are resilient, and some of them are getting pretty tired at times. But I must say, that's one thing I've always said to my parents, that you're doing an incredible job, because it's 24 hours a day for them. And to have this Parent Navigator, I know there's no job description as of yet, I would assume, but I see that as a game changer because so many parents, they're tired, or they're working, if some of them, and finding the time to find the route. And I think Deputy Minister Hartwell, you said there's no standard approach, and I have to agree, and I was very pleased to hear that, and it's a case by case. So these navigators will really help parents, because there's just, every individual case is different, and everybody's needs, and some will need more of other things. And also the nurse, the role of the nurse. I do remember back in the early years, there was a nurse on our school board that did come around to our learning centers and our schools and did work. And a lot of their work was around medication, because there's a lot of medication that students are taking who have autism. And I found the role of the nurse was very important. And parents had a lot of confidence in being able to call that nurse with concerns that, sometimes it's not as easy to get a hold of your GP or your family doctor just to ask a question. So I see that component as a bonus with the navigators, plus the other supports that are going into the inclusive education. How overall, and I guess this would come to the Associate Deputy, do you see the additions to the inclusive education, the supports that were announced yesterday? How is this going to affect people who are in the school system and coming into the school system with autism?
Ms. Gatien?
Well, certainly the aim, and I think it's what will be realized, is that we'll be able to respond to the needs. So this was a needs-based, the way we determined the positions and what was needed, obviously was in part the recommendations from the Commission, but it was also what was ambitious and achievable, for the coming year. So we worked with the regional centers and the school board to say, you know, we want to stretch ourselves, but we also don't want to promise something we can't deliver. And we really want it to be, this is the first phase, this is just the beginning, and it's really to meet the needs of students and teachers and meet the needs that we've been hearing about for a number of years. So what we're hoping is that the supports and services will be there for the students and teachers who need the most.
Ms. Lomas-Croft.
And I see this as a continuum of care with all the stakeholders. And I think it's really great we see the stakeholders here today, which shows that, you know, collaboration is really essential. And I think that when someone presents with autism in the school, and especially in the complex cases, can you probably, I don't know, Ms. Hartwell, maybe you're the best person to direct this. What is there for the protocol when there are complex cases?
Deputy Hartwell.
Thank you. So I'll start and then turn over to my colleagues on how we are, I guess, become aware of a complex case. People come into the community services program and through an assessment, and they often are referred by their family doctor or referred by another family that they know. And the idea is that once they're in our program, we will do an assessment to see what the needs are of the family. That's not a clinical assessment. That is really truly an assessment on what the family might need, knowing that that will change. They're assigned a care coordinator. And then in our direct family support program for children, then they are able to receive respite funding. If things start to change, that can be triggered by the family calling the care coordinator or indicating that behaviors are escalating or that there's perhaps a medical complication that's adding to the complexity, any of those things, then that would trigger our care coordinator to go out and to do a reassessment, but then also to start to make the connections with other professionals that may need to be engaged, whether they're in the health system, whether they're in the education system, to get a sense of what's going on. Our care coordinators do, on a regular basis, do regular reassessments. They stay in contact with the family. So even if the family doesn't contact them, we will be reaching out, and at some point we will be the ones maybe noticing that things have started to escalate or that families are struggling to keep up. And certainly, often families will go to their family doctor or to others, often through the school system, to indicate that things are ramping up. So on our staff on the front line do fabulous work. They have built relationships with colleagues, and they try to, in the work that they're doing every day, to come up with solutions, whether that's making sure that all of the information, that what's happening in the school, for example, that they can be part of a plan to help that continue over the summer months, if we can provide some funding for that kind of thing. There will be cases, though, and these are the ones that we hear about, and the ones that really all of us get involved in occasionally, where the needs of the young person or the family have escalated quite significantly, and that the supports that we're providing or the supports that they're receiving from various do not seem to be meeting their needs at that particular time. That's when we have to do what we're calling a wraparound. We have to have more senior level people who are involved in problem solving, who can bring resources to bear, who can canvass service providers, canvass departments to see what is available and what can be done. And we do have it's called a complex case protocol, which really started from these cases where who can trigger that we actually bring everyone to the table. My colleague is not exaggerating when she says that there are cases currently where there are daily phone calls between senior people trying to problem solve around supporting a particular family and young person. And that isn't perfect, because the complexities that some of these families are facing are significant and can be challenging. And of course, and I'm using the word families deliberately, because often there are other children involved, and so they're parenting children who have all kinds of needs. So sometimes we can provide supports to support those children and not necessarily the child who's on the spectrum. ultimately, when a complex case reaches a point of crisis, we do have our legislation, the Children and Family Support Act, which does allow for parents to enter into a voluntary agreement with the minister to have a child placed temporarily in care. That is an absolute last resort, and it is not one that any family would ever consider lightly, and it should never be held out as a panacea, not that anyone would ever want it to be, because kids need families, and if they come into the minister's care, we are not always able to recreate a family setting, and we don't want children to not be in families. So all of the work around the complex case protocol, all of our work is very much focused on supporting that family as much as we can and providing that wraparound that allows them to continue their parenting role for the health of their whole family, including that child.
Slomas Croft.
I think
Dr. Link.
Thank you. I just wanted to add one piece of the system improvement puzzle that we haven't talked about, and certainly we can get better in all sorts of areas, from crisis to intensive supports, both preschool, children and older teens and young adults. There's lots of room for improvement. But I think we are making some progress for sure. One thing we haven't mentioned is the role of the community pediatrician. And I just wanted to bring that up. I was a pediatrician in Cape Breton for 25 years before coming down to Halifax. And we work closely with our education colleagues and our colleagues in community services. And the community pediatrician who works with the families, gets to know the families in concert with the family doc. But they add a lot in terms of being that navigator person who can coordinate, who can manage medications if it needs to be, who meets with schools, who meets with DCS, who helps prevent crisis. So I would just say that one goal we have in the province, and we're pretty close to it with a few exceptions, that every child in the province, no matter if you live in Yarmouth or Liverpool or Inverness, should have reasonable access to a community pediatrician, which for whatever special needs you have, including autism. Huge value in that. And we work with DHW in our HR planning, and we're going to be adding one new pediatrician that we've just got funded for HRM, for example, but all through the province, everybody should have that access. And I think that will go a long way in having those local advocates for the child working in concert with our partners. I think one thing as a community pediatrician that I think goes a long way for kids with special needs is every school board. I know we don't have all the school boards anymore, but everywhere in the province that we have sufficient number of social workers attached to families of schools, which I know we did in Cape Breton for a long time. That might be under a little bit of reduction, but a social worker who can work with children and families is worth their weight in gold. If I had to choose between an MRI machine and a social worker, I'll take the social worker any day in terms of the good it does.
I think there's usually a social worker connected, and at least the teams I've worked with the schools, there's been the caseworker and the social worker, their learning center teachers, principals. Like, I'm quite impressed with the teams that we have around, and I think there was a question about the resource centers. I know in the South Shore we had an incredible autism resource center that was staffed with a high-end EA or TA that they call them now, who also went out in the field. So if you were working in a learning center and you needed some aids, this person would come in and observe and help get those aids into the learning centers and the classrooms where they're needed. So I can't speak for the whole province, but I do know and so sure that we have a pretty awesome center where parents can access it as well as educators and other people. And it's been quite successful. So
can I add just one quick point, really quick point? Sorry. Just the social workers also help the families.
Dr. Link?
Sorry, the social workers also help the families, and there's all sorts of families, a full spectrum of families who have their own struggles and challenges, whether you have a child with special needs or not. The one last point I'd quickly make is that we have an opportunity with the new provincial school board or advisory council. That's going to be constituted, I think, in the next couple of months, but I would really put strong advice, and I've written to the minister before that there be a community pediatrician on that advisory council to give that health angle and also to advocate for kids with special needs and to work with our education partners, which we've done in the past, which has really added a huge value. Thank you. I just wrote that.
Ms. Lomas-Croft.
1 minute. Oh gosh. Transitions are challenging, and that's one of the biggest challenges when you're working day to day with autism. I'm in particular interested in the transitions, like from grade 9 to from junior high to senior high, but also at the end of the school, when they become adults and they're going out of the school system. And I've worked on grade 9 to grade 10 transition teams, but I haven't been there for the grade 12 or when they max out at 21 if they stay in the system. What transitions are there? The associate deputy.
Okay. Ms. Gatien.
Hi, I'm going to ask Susan Jozsa, who has more in-depth information on that, to answer yours.
Ms. Jozsa.
Thank you. You're quite right when you note that our students with ASD really can sometimes struggle with transitions, and we're particularly mindful of the transitions, big life transitions that occur when our children move from wherever they were preschool into school, as they go through school, and then the life-changing transitions that we need to consider as our youth move from junior high into high school, and then planning for a life beyond school. And our program planning teams begin to look at transition for our students with autism on an individual basis, working with families. Pardon?
And we'll revert back to Mr. Houston for 11 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just two quick questions before I pass to my colleague for the IWK. You mentioned the complex care coordinator. I think that's a position that was vacant for 6 or 7 months. Do you know if that position's filled now?
Ms. Vine?
Thank you. Yes, we do have clinicians who have extra expertise in complex care coordination. And actually, for any young person that is going through a transition from a healthcare environment, particularly, whichever domain it is, medical, psychiatric, we do have quite a nice roster of people with highly skilled backgrounds in complex case, so those do happen. And what we do from the very beginning of admissions, medical or otherwise, is to call in the partners, if it's complex, to call the partners, as we've been talking about earlier, bringing in the workers that might be assigned either through school or through the DCS, and making sure that we're doing a care plan that is understood across all of the system.
So is there
Mr. Houston?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is there a position that actually, is there somebody that has the title complex care coordinator?
Ms. Vine?
I'm not sure that we have that position named that way, but we have, as was mentioned, the important role of social work, and particularly for complex care areas. That's where the social workers in the Gatien unit, for example, they would be focused on that work.
Okay.
Mr. Houston?
Thank you. And I think in responses earlier, you mentioned about a transition plan. There's a transition plan after a child has been staying at the IWK.
Yes.
And in the case of the Sutherlands, the transition plan was kind of a 4-day notice to vacate, to leave, right? So could that happen today? Or is there a system where the transition would be a little less abrupt than we need you out of here in 4 days because we can't care for you?
Ms. Vine?
I would like to say that we are able to pull resources together in a cohesive manner, and it is, that planning is done very much with parents involved, again, from the beginning. But I do recognize, and I don't think any of us would underestimate the stress and strain that families are undergoing that would lead them to come into the system in the first place, and those transitions home are very stressful. So we do make every effort to plan ahead, help people understand what the plan plan is while the inpatient care is going on, but also understanding what the step-down resources would be. And we do have clinicians who transition from an inpatient environment into the home as well. But I wouldn't want to underestimate. In situations of severe complexity, it is challenging across our system, and most especially for families themselves.
Ms. Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am really curious to know how many of the recommendations from the Autism Nova Scotia report from 2017 that all of the departments have embraced. But the one that I'm most concerned about, because it's the one that I hear about the most, is the access to getting a diagnosis. Because if you don't have a diagnosis, you can't access any of the programs or funding or respite. So the families are out in the cold until they get the diagnosis. And in particular, I have a military community where they'll wait on a wait list to get in to see for diagnosis, but then they get posted, so then they start on another list. And I have people who didn't get their child diagnosed until they were 12. And so most of those in the military families ended up paying privately for their diagnosis. So just for the record, because it hasn't been mentioned, my understanding from the autism report is that the prevalence of ASD was 1 in 2,500 in the 1960s. It was 1 in 110 in the 1990s, and it's 1 in 68 now. So clearly, the needs are more pressing. So I have two questions, and I would like to address it to Dr. Link. How many people are waiting on a wait list to get assessed for this now compared to, say, 5-10 years ago? Because the report suggests that the wait time is between 1.5 to 2 years, but yet children are getting diagnosed between the ages of 3 and 5. So there's a really narrow window there. So I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about the wait time to get diagnosed in Nova Scotia.
Dr. Link.
So it's a good question, and it's a bit complicated too. And so if I was up in Cape Breton and I would see a child who came in the office between the ages of 2 and 3, often because they weren't speaking, would be the first thing that parents would notice. As community pediatricians who would see these children, for many of them, not all of them, but for many of them, you can make a diagnosis in the office, have a pretty strong suspicion. Then you go on a wait list for an official diagnosis, and that's depending on where you live in the province. That's usually with a psychologist and or a developmental pediatrician. And that can take sometimes up to, it can be quick, it can be a couple months, or it can be up to a year and a bit for preschool children. But in the meantime, I just want to let you know that as a community pediatrician, if I have a child who I think has autism, or I'm pretty sure has autism, I can start the speech therapy part, get their hearing checked, do genetic testing, get early intervention services involved, and if the parents need any help through DCS or things, I can do all of that. So it's not like waiting for the official diagnosis means you don't get any services at all. You certainly can get some services. And then once they get the official diagnosis, and you're right, some parents, and I would say not all parents, but more parents today than maybe 10, 15 years ago have health care plans that for about $150 from the parents, they can have a private psychologist make the diagnosis so we can get that done earlier. That's not for everybody. Obviously, we have lots of people who can't afford that, but some can. And then they can get placed on the wait list for the EIBI, the Early Intervention Program, which they get before they start grade primary. The bigger problem, I think, for diagnosis where people wait longer, and I take your point for the military family, that would be very distressing and frustrating when people move, and we do have people moving all the time. That can take a couple of years sometimes. Again, the community pediatrician may be able to make the diagnosis in concert with the school. I should say a suspected diagnosis, and again, some families can go down the route to private testing if they have to, but in terms of public testing, that can take a couple of years sometimes, no question. And then that can delay them getting disability tax credits, that can delay all the extra sort of services that they can get. So can we do better, especially in school age and young adult? No question, that's a gap. There are numbers before me, but what I see is that these fluctuate, and especially for people who are school age, they're too long, if I can summarize it that way. We can provide you with numbers, specific numbers later on, but the wait times are too long now for school age for sure.
Okay.
Ms. Adams.
Thank you for that. The number you quoted was $150 for a psychologist to get diagnosed, and the parents that I have in the autism support group in my community, they had to pay for a full assessment, which was somewhere around $1,500 to $1,800, right. and they can't afford that.
Right.
So they went without diagnosis. So my question now, again back to Dr. Link, is we have a lot of families who don't have a family doctor.
Right.
So they can't get referred to a psychologist because they need a referral in order to get any amount covered under their private health plan, or to get into the IWK. So what should you and what do we tell parents who don't have a family doctor and they suspect their child has this disorder?
Yeah.
Dr. Link?
Yeah. That's a tough problem for sure. What would happen I can only speak of my practice in Cape Breton because I do just in-hospital work in Halifax, but in that case, if either a social worker or a school board teacher or somebody, they would just refer to my office, for example, and we would see that child if they were school age. If they didn't have a family doctor, it wouldn't matter. But someone would have to sort of advocate for that as well.
Okay.
Preschool, that is a problem. I mean, that's a problem for kids getting vaccinations, getting all sorts of things. So we are working hard, as you know, to try to recruit and have more positions for family. We have the positions, but try to recruit to fill those spots. Yeah, but it's a huge issue across the spectrum. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. One of the big questions then is, given the high incidence of this condition, is it time possibly to move towards the family doctor being able to make the diagnosis? I mean, it's fairly rare for conditions to be diagnosed by somebody other than a physician. This is one of them. But given the incidence, is it possible for that's something we need to move towards as well? All the other allied health professionals, we're training the teachers, but the other allied health professionals need that training perhaps at the beginning of their career as well.
Dr. Link?
So it's a great question. There are screening tools that are built into something called the Rourke record. And the Rourke record is what we use to do the well-child check as infancy and preschoolers. And if you had the time, it would probably take about 25 minutes to do a complete Rourke record. And then in addition, you could do a screening tool if that came up. To make the actual diagnosis would probably require an hour or two or three. There are other tools, and practically speaking, for busy family physicians who we don't have enough of right at the moment, that wouldn't be a practical solution. It could be for community pediatricians to be trained, and they do this in Ontario now, and we're talking about it here. Community pediatricians can actually make the diagnosis using tools without people having to go to expensive psychologists.
Time.
Thank you.
We'll go to the NDP Caucus and Lisa Roberts.
Thank you very much. I want to direct my questions to the Department of Community Services, particularly around respite services through the Direct Family Support Program and eligibility for that program. It appears that there is I almost want to call it a loophole, but it's not so much a loophole as just a gap that many kids with autism and their families fall through, because the eligibility, I understand, for that program, you know, there's a number of different criteria that would result in eligibility. Two of them require intellectual developmental disability, and the other is significant physical disability. And children with autism do not necessarily have an intellectual disability. I mean, at least if you're measuring it with IQ. So would you agree that there is a current gap for families with children with autism, 45% of which don't have what you would typically call an intellectual disability?
Deputy Hartwell.
Thank you for that question. We are looking at the IQ requirement for certain. I would say that when the policy was created, there was that standard seemed to be a reasonable one, but as we are learning more about the complexities of autism and some of the extreme behaviors that may come that is not associated with an intellectual disability, and yet that child is, has an impairment and may have all sorts of challenges, behavioral challenges. So we are absolutely looking at that. That has been identified as a gap, and I would say that if currently, while we're assessing what would be a reasonable replacement, a reasonable assessment replacement. If there are families that are in that situation, then come to us and we will be able to do some other things to try to work with that situation, because we certainly are aware that the policy as it was developed several years ago is not keeping up with what we now are learning more about autism.
Ms. Roberts?
I would welcome some further comments from Mr. Rudderham, who looks like he might have something to say. No? Okay, maybe it's just the face again. And I guess I say I welcome further comment, because I mean frankly it's great for a deputy minister to say to an MLA, come and talk to us, but on the ground when you're a family member and you're trying to get access and there's a policy that is on the books which says you are not eligible, you don't have the access that I as an MLA have to you, a deputy minister, in this room. So how is that practically working for people? Because frankly we're hearing from Autism Nova Scotia that it's actually not working very well for many families.
Mr. Rudderham.
Thank you, and I need some training in facial expressions. What I would say is, I would agree with my deputy that there's definitely is a gap, and we've identified IQ as not necessarily an appropriate, and other provinces have identified IQ as not an appropriate measurement to gain access. What's critically important is that we provide the right supports and services to families where we've identified that there are significant behavioral issues. And the example you gave, I think you gave it, Lisa, previously, was around the Eng family. And there's an example of, and I know Kewen, and I know Tristan, I know the family quite well. Kewen has a very high IQ. He's incredibly intelligent. But he's also an individual that has been provided supports and services through the Department of Community Services. I think I can say that. So there are ways and means in which we will sort of bypass what we now consider to be an eligibility requirement that's not necessarily working. It's not working because getting access to the assessment piece, and it's not working because I think, and I'm going on a limb here, but I think a lot of the psychologists who would have done this in the past are not comfortable with doing it on a go-forward basis. So we know we need to change it. Part of what we're doing around assessment in itself is we also recognize that we need a really good assessment methodology and associated tool, not only for our adult program participants, but as well for children. What we can't, what we need to make sure is that we actually allocate very, very limited resources to families that need it the most, and just a very particular diagnosis of ASD on the spectrum. If it's an individual that has a very high IQ and limited or to no behavioral, that doesn't necessarily mean that supports and services should be provided through the Department of Community Services program. But if there are functional limitations, if there are behavioral issues, we all agree that those families need to access services.
Ms. Roberts.
Thank you. And I will just voice out loud my concern that while I guess that this gap has actually been identified for 7 years running now, and that my concern is that one possible reason why it has not been acted on is not only the difficulty in coming up with an assessment tool, but frankly that we are dealing with I guess a government-decided scarcity of resources where it is a way of limiting those who are eligible. Again, Mr. Rudderham's face is wonderful. He shakes his head no. No. Okay. Can I just respond to that?
Please. Mr. Rudderham.
I'm not disagreeing with you, and I think the real positive point here is that we recognize that the IQ itself is not a good measure, and we're taking measures to fix that. But families who are in need, we are supporting, and again, the Eng family is a good example where the IQ we wouldn't have been providing supports, but we found a way to do it because the family was in crisis, and we needed to provide the supports and services.
Okay, thank you.
Deputy Hartwell.
Oh. I just wanted to add, just on the resourcing, the Disability Support Program is the program that has received the most funding increase over the last decade, and that's in part because of the complexities of the cases that we've seen. We have been over the last year, so I don't want you to think it's just a new idea, probably starting about 2 years ago, we started the work to look at what would be appropriate assessment methodology for the services that we provide. So again, less about a clinical diagnosis, much more about a family, instrumental activities of daily living, what is required. And so we have received the funding to move forward with a new methodology this year. So it's really been, as part of our transformation, we've been looking at having that kind of reliable methodology so that we can actually make sure that we're getting the resources where they need to go.
Ms. Roberts.
I've promised my colleague a few minutes, and I'm afraid that we'll get into a big conversation, so I'll pass it over to
Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Quickly, I know a lot of the attention, a lot of the resources, a lot of the programs are geared towards young people with autism. But one situation that stood out for me as a former Minister of Health and doing updates on the EIBI program are that there are a number of adults who are diagnosed with autism, and they have older parents who are the caregivers. So what is being done to look at what happens when those caregivers age and when they pass on? Is there work being done currently to address that need and that demand that's just around the corner, I believe, as the population gets older, especially here in Nova Scotia?
Deputy Hartwell.
Thank you. Yes, you're absolutely right that there is another demographic challenge, and that is the one that comes with aging parents who are supporting family members, sons and daughters, with a wide variety of challenges, some of which may be autism, some of which may be developmental delays, etc. And it is a source of worry. That's one of the things that we're taking into account as we're transforming our system, because most of those folks have been caring on their own, so the family member may not have their own network of supports, their own natural community. So we have been investing some supports in what we call our adult day programs. Because where people sleep, where people live is one part of it. It's what they do during the day, their ability to have their own friendships, their own lives, their own jobs, all of those things. And they may have had a quite sheltered experience. So we are working closely with the Directions Council, which is the lead for all of the day programs that we fund, to not just create more opportunities. We're looking at what we're calling actually pilots looking at transitions of young people from high school into adulthood, but also transitions of people who have been at home and who now need to start to form their own lives. That's the day piece, which is important, and we sometimes don't talk enough about that. We also are focused, of course, on the residential piece. As you know, several years ago, the province committed to a roadmap to really change our focus on how we support people with disabilities to live more independently in community. And I say the province because it was, of course, a different government brought it in, endorsed by all three parties, a really clear statement that Nova Scotia was taking in a direction. And it is taking time, in part because of the complexities of some of the, well, all of the individuals are unique and have their own needs. And I would say that we have a system that is focused quite heavily on larger facilities and people who've lived in those larger facilities for some time, and helping to support those people to transition to community is a long process, and one that has to be done safely and one that has to be done respectfully with their needs and wishes at the centre. We are investing in more small options home, which
we'll now go to the Liberal Caucus and Hugh McKay.
Actually, Mr. Chair, with your permission, I'd like Ms. Lonscroft to be able to finish a question that she had started, and then perhaps revert back to me. Thank you.
Ms. Lonscroft.
Yes, I think we left off with Ms. Jozsa about transitioning from the school system into adulthood. And probably, Ms. Hartwell, you could add on, because that's when respite care is really going to kick in, and possibly the job coaching. Is that your, okay. Ms. Jozsa?
Okay. Ms. Jozsa.
Thank you very much. When last we were talking, we were discussing the preparation for students. Once they get into junior high, we begin to work with families to talk about what their hopes are for their students, what the students' interests are. Transition is very individual, and so we work with families beginning at that stage to develop a plan through program planning for where the student is headed, what skills the student needs to acquire so that they can meet their potential and acquire those skills that will set them up for leaving and entering community. We also work with our partners in other government departments and other associations or agencies to look ahead to what supports families may need to access, and we help to prepare them to do that. We have a program for our students post-secondary called Achieve that we have developed in partnership with NSCC that helps to prepare our students with special needs, including those with autism, for potential post-secondary study. We have 7 sites, Achieve sites, in conjunction with NSCC, and we'll be adding 2 additional sites. We also look at if the student is able to continue post-secondary, we try to help support them to head in that direction. If the student is going to require more training and being in a work placement setting, we try to support them in learning the skills that will allow them to be successful. And then it really does call upon us to work with our partners because they're often the ones who are developing those programs post-secondary.
Ms. Hartwell. Ms. Hartwell, the respite and the job coaching that comes with all that.
Thank you for that question. And absolutely. So I referenced the adult service centers and the day programs. I did want to add there that not only are we looking at increasing the capacity, but we want to look at increasing the capacity for those organizations to work with young people who have more in-depth challenge. So, so if there's a young person who has a particular need, that they actually have the skill and the ability to put the required adaptations in place. The job coaching pilot that we are launching this year is really exciting because it is about the possibility that young people with autism bring to the table. Incredible families, incredible young people who want to be contributing and may need some support in how they're approaching jobs, understanding what adaptations, if any, might be required, but also it's about creating employers that are, we call them disability confident employers, employers who know how to work with, recruit with, work with, support, people who may seem different, who may have a different way of looking at the world, but that actually is a benefit. So we are working with Autism Nova Scotia on that, and that's couldn't be more thrilled. That's exactly the right organization. I would say that there are some incredible advocacy organizations who are trying to support overall inclusion of more people with disabilities, including people with autism, in all of the employment supports, knowing that we also have responsibility, of course, for income assistance, and we know that people with disability can be overrepresented in our income assistance program, in part because they're not able to make that job attachment. I did want to mention that we also have, through our employment support program, we have a support called a workplace attendant support program. So we actually will fund, if there is a young person that needs an attendant with them to attend a job as they get used to that, we'll fund that attendant's salary to be able to go to the job with that young person and help with the adaptations. It's probably a bit undersubscribed, to be honest.
Will that work for day programs? Oh, sorry. Would that work for day programs? Because often the day programs are teaching the the clients, I think they become clients at that stage, they're teaching them skills that they can use for the workforce.
Ms. Hartwell?
I would say the workplace attendant program is really about not necessarily in those environments. The day programs themselves often have staff who have that skill set. That is actually the staff that we're funding there. And when you think about some of the programs around the province, think of Summer Street Industries, for example, incredible organization, strong social enterprise. They have programming that not only supports people with a sense of community, a sense of vocation, all of those things. They also are supporting people to work in the mainstream labor market. And that's really the goal for many young people, and I would say particularly young people with autism who just need a slightly different support and orientation so that they can succeed on their own. So I'm really interested in exploring that.
Okay. Thank you. I'll pass it over to Mr. McKay.
Mr. McKay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through the growing awareness of autism, I think we all recognize now that it is a spectrum, that there is a broad range, and of course much attention has gone into some of the complex cases, and some of the we've mentioned the Sutherland family and the Ang case today, and of course these are the things that will attract public awareness and attention, which is good to bring attention onto the autism spectrum. But of course there are hundreds of other cases that you're dealing with that do not get that kind of exposure, which is a good thing. And you know, I agree with Ms. Vine's comment earlier of the stress and strain, though, that is on families all across the spectrum. I guess he'd be a great nephew on the spectrum, my niece's son, who's been very well served, I'd say. He's not a complex case, but he's been very well served, I'd say, particularly by the wraparound approach that is becoming more common. And one of the best things there that has supported my family has been in respite care, without a doubt. And while I know you've touched on that in your response to Ms. Lonescroft, I was wondering if perhaps we could go into a little bit more on respite, particularly from the family support program, and as to what types of respite services are available, because I need to convey that back to my constituents. And so I'll direct that to DCS, perhaps Ms. Hartwell or
Mr. Rudderham.
Thank you for the question. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that we've done, and we first did it in the adult program, was to increase the nature of flexibility and what parents and what families can use the respite dollars for. You know, they could traditionally it was just to bring somebody in or to have their loved one go to another location for respite for the family. Now families can actually use the funding for a variety of opportunities. It could be going to the movies, for example. It could be hiring very specific staff, for example. Basically what it is what the family needs. We've also looked to reduce sort of the administrative burden on families, because, you know, keeping track of receipts and doing all those things, for families who are receiving $500 or less, we say we don't want any receipts. We trust you. Our care coordinators know who you are, know that you're using this money wisely and using the money to provide support for your loved ones. So we've increased the flexibility of that, and we're also adapting the same flexibility in the children's program as well. So enabling families to use the resources the best way, because families know best, and you know, we want to make sure that families can continue to do that. So there are no very specific limitations per se. There are some guidelines in the policy, but it is quite flexible.
Okay, thank you
Mr.
for that.
McKay, and we have about a minute left.
Okay, thank you. I would note that my niece and her husband's family are a military family, and they have been in many jurisdictions, and they certainly have commented to me that Nova Scotia, particularly as we're moving forward now with some of the programs announced, is a leader in the Federation, and that's good to hear. In the time that's left, I'm just wondering then, perhaps Ms. Gatien, if I've got the name correct, if you could just comment on what the announcement yesterday means to your department and the services you'll be able to deliver.
Ms. Gatien?
I think in a nutshell, it really means that inclusion will really be the driver of our work. First and foremost, it'll be it'll be the work of the regional centres and the French School Board, and it'll be really shifting the system to be more focused on needs. What do students need? What do teachers need? And there's a lot of work ahead, certainly, but we're anxious for it. We know it's needed, and it's really to respond to what we've been hearing for a number of years, and it's exciting for us.
That is time. So we'll open up for closing comments. If we could keep them short and sweet, that'd be great. Deputy Perret.
Certainly on behalf of the health side of this equation, we just appreciate the opportunity to be here and to participate in what is a very important discussion. Thank you.
Deputy Hartwell.
Thank you. I reiterate that comment, and just because I don't think I did a very good job answering it earlier, I'm going to say now. We have gotten to a point where we don't really actually care who's the one that convenes the meetings. We are committed to working in concert to make sure that when there's information that comes forward, whether it be a report, whether it be a new piece of research, whether it be a case that is one that we really all need to scramble, what you see before you are partners that are ready to wrap around and forge a new way of working. And we're seeing some results. We still have more to do. So we really thank you for the opportunity to talk about it.
And the last words to education and Ms. Gatien.
Yes, I want to thank you as well for the opportunity to be here. And I really want to echo what Deputy Hartwell just said. You know, it really, whether we're the lead or we're part of the team, we see it, we're all responsible to make a difference and meet the needs of students and teachers in our case as well. So we're really pleased and excited to work. This is real wraparound service. We talk about a lot of that in our system, but this is what it looks like in government as well, how we all come together and work together to improve the lives for Nova Scotians. So thank you for the time.
Thank you for your time today, and we'll give the committee 30 seconds for the witnesses to move out. Okay, we'll jump right in. There is no committee business. The member from Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just looking ahead at the schedule, I think we have an open date on May 23rd. I'd like to make a motion that we invite the Internal Services Department to appear before committee on the 23rd to talk about protection of personal data and government's response when personal data has been compromised. Of course, people watch the news. We saw that the charges were dropped against the young man that was villainized in this house on numerous occasions by ministers and as high up as the Premier. So I'd like for this committee to hear directly from the Department of Internal Services as to how their plan for response when Nova Scotians' personal private information is compromised through the computer system. So I'd like to make a motion that we invite Internal Services to appear on the 23rd of May.
Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I would support that motion. I think with light of the recent events and the ongoing question around how safe is the information that the government has on Nova Scotians, I think it's important to bring internal services here. Government needs to be transparent and open, and here is a good way to do that. And I would think the Department of Internal Services would welcome a chance to come to public accounts and discuss this issue. So we would support that motion.
Ms. Lomas-Croft.
We voted on this twice before, very similar motions, and We said before that the Auditor General and the FOIP officer are both investigating this. This can be brought up in an agenda-setting meeting, but we will not vote in favor of that.
So this has been brought up several times before. The vote was clear the last couple of times, and I will defer this for next week when the chair is here and allow them to have discussion around agenda setting. So that's fine. So we'll allow. So I'll wait for next week for the chair to return. But as was stated earlier, this has been voted on twice, I think, with yeas and raising of hands. So with that, our next meeting date is May 16th. Department of Seniors will be here for the Nova Scotia Action Plan for an Aging Population and Age-Friendly Community Grants. Mr. Houston.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a clarity, the motion. There's been similar motions before. This is a motion that's placed before the committee today. Is it not necessary for the committee to vote on a motion that's put before it? Can the vote be deferred? Maybe you can check with the Ledge Council. I'd like to see it brought to a vote. Is that necessary, or is that at the discretion of the chair?
So this has been brought up several times. It's essentially the same motion that's been here the last two public accounts. The results was a no, and it was a wait and see for the Auditor General and the Privacy Commissioner to do their work. You know, I don't see the purpose of voting on something again and again and again. But this is an agenda-setting topic. And if the chair, when he returns next week, wants to have a discussion in camera or in public around adding to the agenda, that'll be up to the chair. But as of right now, there is no need to. I don't see the need to do that without the chair here to help set the agenda. Thank you. And with that, we'll close the meeting.